Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Gaming Materialists, our monthly dive into the world of tabletop gaming. I'm your host, Djene Bajalan, and I am joined today, as always, by my co-host. He is the pit bull of left podcasting. He's the bad dad of BreadTube. He is Doug Lane's platonic life partner. He is C. Derek Vaughn. Welcome, Vaughn. How are you doing this morning? Oh, your sound is off, Vaughn.
I'm okay.
Excellent. Well, it's good to see you. It is an early morning. We are pre-recording for the Wednesday show, but it is actually Sunday, the day of rest. So we are really putting in that extra effort for you. And of course, everybody watching out there, this show is being carried both on the TIR channel and on the VarnVlog channel. So remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell. If you can become a patron of one or both of our shows. If you are so wealthy, you can do that. And of course, for all the TIR people out there, I just want to remind you, we have some pretty hot new merch, including the very popular Anglo-Pessimism t-shirt. So
Which I have ordered.
Oh, you've ordered the Anglo-Pessimism t-shirt.
Yeah, it's supposed to arrive in like a week.
It was a shirt literally designed for you. It's the perfect Vine shirt. Well, without further ado, let's get on with today's show. And today we are going to be talking about Appendix N. And for those of you who don't know what Appendix N is, in very broad terms, it is the list of books that inspired Gary Gygax in Dungeons and Dragons. And we're going to be joined by two kind of experts on this list. We're joined by Hoi and Jeff of Appendix N Book Club to talk about the politicization of sword and sorcery, the Appendix N book list, the actual politics of that list, and the politics of dungeon crawl classics and other old school Renaissance or old school Renaissance adjacent games. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with the old school Renaissance, this is a term that is being used to refer to what we call retro gaming. That is, people playing modified versions or republished versions of early Dungeons and Dragons. So, 5e, the common edition played today by most people, was created in, I think, 2014. But there's a lot of people who are still interested in playing the types of games that, people were playing in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And generally, we refer to those games that, are being produced now as old school Renaissance. So let us bring our guests. Hello, Jeff.
Howdy.
And hello, Hoi. Welcome.
Very happy to be here this morning.
Hey, it's wonderful to have you. So, I'll start with the first question. What inspired you guys to do a book club on Appendix N, and sort of how did you get into reading this Appendix N literature?
Well, Hoi and I ended up meeting together through the DCC NYC meetup group. Real quick, and just so that your viewers, listeners know, the reason why it's called the Appendix N is in 1979 in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, there's a bunch of appendices in the back. And Appendix N is the appendix where Gary Gygax listed out the books that he says inspired D&D, and he encourages you to read to inspire your own gaming. But yes, so the reason why Hoi and I decided to do this is he and I both became big fans of Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I started a Dungeon Crawl Classics meetup group in New York. And as a part of that, I also started an Appendix N Book Club where we could get together and read in person. And Hoi was attending every single one of them. And at a certain point, Hoi was like, we should do something with this. This should be like a podcast or a book, or like we should be having like a weekly blog or something. And since I was already podcasting, I was one of the co-hosts of Spellburn, the podcast about Dungeon Crawl Classics. Hoi and I decided to start the podcast.
Can you tell us a little bit what Dungeon Crawl Classics is? Because I don't think everybody watching or listening will be familiar with Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Sure. So Dungeon Crawl Classics, some people would argue, is actually not an OSR game, because Dungeon Crawl Classics is not built on the old school D&D rule sets. It's actually a D20 3.5 OGL game. It's like built on that.
Right.
On those game mechanics.
Stripped down to the bone and then rebuilt on top of that. Yeah. So
Exactly. It's a very stripped down version of it with a very old school feel to it. It's very much embracing that kind of wild gonzo swinginess of like the way like old school gaming used to be.
Right. So it's let's just say it's a spiritual old school Renaissance game. It's more it's not exactly the mechanics, but it's a role play game which has that feel and style.
right. It very much had that aesthetic of the 70s, like all black and white art and not hyper realistic, not very polished, CGI, Photoshop, like in the, Paizo, Pathfinder games or from 3.5 onwards. So it gives that feeling of sort of a DIY-ness. And the rule set is also sort of deliberately incomplete so that people can sort of really fill in the blanks.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you're not going to find the rules of for drowning on page 271. It's like they give you basically what you need to get going, and everything else they encourage you to just make up rules on the fly.
The DCC has a very interesting feel, and I remember looking at it and going, okay. When I actually heard about it from you, Jeff, on a podcast that had nothing to do with gaming. Believe it or not. So I was listening to Elder Signs, and you appeared, and you started talking about Appendix N literature. So I then went to your podcast and then heard you guys talk about DCC, and I went and got the book, and now I have like all the Lankmar boxes, and I'm waiting for the Die on Earth boxes, etc.
Yes.
So
one of us.
And I've been kind of following what Goodman Games does, because they also do the D&D old school reincarnated line and stuff like that. And I'm also an OSR, and this was before I knew about DCC, an OSR player. So I was very interested in the politics around it, because I associated the Appendix N with good literature, but good literature had been picked up by a group of kind of reactionary gamers and sci-fiers to posit a kind of depoliticized sci-fi world that I don't think those books are. They're all over the map politically, but I don't think one thing you can't say is that they don't have political values or whatever. And recently I saw that DCC was updating their pronoun usage in their 9th free printing of the main manual. And there was a kind of more polarized response than I'm used to seeing. Like I did see, like you saw this on Amazon. If you go and read Amazon reviews of like certain Wizards of the Coast products for D&D, you will see some of that. And it has a kind of big following, but it gets drowned out pretty quickly, and just like the sheer mass of the people following it who don't care about the politics at all. And I was wondering, like, why was the response more polarized for the Goodman Game? Because Goodman Games didn't seem like a particularly reactionary company, honestly. Even back before it was making explicit choices like that, it had inclusive. It had people of color in the artwork. It was like the 70s, but without all the exclusion. So, what did you make of that?
I mean, there's a lot that we have to respond to here, because you also started off with talking about the Appendix N being co-opted by the right as well. And so I feel like these are two different topics, but and I would love to explore both of them if we can. But starting up with where you left off with the DCC pronoun usage, Goodman Games is not a terribly progressive gaming company by instinct. If you look at the first printing of the DCC RPG core book, there really aren't hardly any, if any, people of color represented in the artwork there. That stuff that came later with the modules, excuse me, but that's the thing is, although Goodman Games themselves isn't terribly progressive, the people who are really involved in the the furthering of the creation of the game, the writers, the artists, they do tend to be. And because of their influence, DCC's become much more progressive. We see a lot more representations of people of color in the artwork and things like that. Not as progressive as like companies like Paizo or Wizards of the Coast, but definitely moving in that direction. But I don't think it's Goodman Games' instinct to do that. Not that they are actively trying not to do those things. I just don't think that's really that's not really in the area of things that they're like thinking about. So it requires other people to bring it to their attention that you might want to reconsider this.
Right.
And with the 9th printing, Brendan LaSalle contacted me specifically because he knows that diversity and inclusion and things like these that are things that are very important to me. He specifically emailed me and was like, hey, Jeff, if you, from a diversity and inclusion perspective, what would you change about the DCC core book, if anything? And I was like, oh, I would change a lot. And I sent him a very long email outlining everything that I would change, including pronoun usages, getting rid of like words like swordsman and replacing it with like, warrior or whatever you want to put in there. So I'm not going to take claim for having this happened, but I do know that specifically Brendan came to me and I came back to him with that, and that change is now happening. So if I'm not the reason, then I am one of multiple people who shared that same perspective, and that's now why that's happening.
Oh my God! So all the people must be going, you woked our game. You turned it into a woke game.
I mean, I would say that the ethos of DCC, and Jeff, I know you have started to jump on that. I think the ethos of DCC, even though they're not necessarily consciously thinking about it, the ethos of DCC has always been very open and welcoming. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this is just a natural evolution of that, right? They've always been like a very strong con presence. They've always been like, hey, come join our game. Here's an extra seat, this kind of thing like that. And so it just takes a little step further and say, okay, well, who aren't we inviting to the table so far, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think the it's just a natural evolution for them.
I think that's an important point, Hoi. Like a lot of people, you have companies perhaps that are explicitly, progressive, or like making a very big drive to be progressive. But there are a lot of game companies which were not necessarily reactionary, but just because when people were playing in the 80s, it was just like all white dudes, so they just didn't even think about it. Mm-hmm. This is what a lot of the writers for Games Workshop said. It's like, oh no, we didn't make any of this deliberately to be exclusionary. We were just like white guys living in like England in a monoculture. So that game reflected us. We're totally fine with it becoming more diverse. So you've got sort of that tendency within gaming companies. And would you say like Goodman perhaps fits more into that thing? They're not opposed to diversity. It's just not necessarily something that came across their mind, first off the bat. But then you also have a reactionary, like who like, no, I don't want minorities in my game, right? Or like I don't want to. How could you have a black paladin? That makes no sense.
Right.
Yeah, it's the same people who get upset about Black Santa and Black Jesus.
Right.
It's like, come on, people.
Right. And I think that, I'm not following this super closely. I know this sort of blew up in the last month or so as of time of recording. But from what I've seen, it's really nobody who's actually sort of prominent and involved in DCC, the proselytizing of DCC. It's not any of the people who are prominent in the sort of online, in the convention scene. In fact, it's been very, very supportive of these changes.
I agree.
So it's more people who have been playing it because they thought it was their safe space in sort of modern gaming is play DCC, right? For like, it's a funny thing to say, but it's their safe space to be like, hey, this is how it was in my basement in the 80s, right? And I don't want any change. Which is again kind of strange because I was there in the 70s and 80s, and we didn't have enough women playing, but it was as diverse as the group that is always around you. So that just reflects your experience. So anyway,
and it seems like there's people always saying like, well, yeah, like we let anybody play at our table. We don't care. We're not like, we're not kicking people out. And like, yes, people say that, but that is very different than actively going out of your way to make it very clear that this space is something that you're invited into. Those are two very different things. And even looking at like early D&D, like absolutely, like if you had asked any random D&D player, would you like more women to be playing with you? I'm sure most of them would have said yes. But then like you look at like the early issues of Dragon Magazine where like they have the female versions of the different classes. You can play a female fighter or a female wizard. And those classes all have lower hit die, slower XP progression, but have powers of seduction. And it's like, of course, that's going to make like most women cringe and not want to play that. So like, it's clear, it's like written by dudes for dudes. So sure, you want to have more women playing, but you're not actually doing anything to make that space more inviting for them. Right. And now when people do those things, people somehow see it as a threat to this thing that they love, as though people are, attacking this thing that they've held so dear to them. And it's like, we're not saying that there's no longer space for heterosexual, white, cisgender men. They are still absolutely welcome at the table. We're just now saying we are also telling everybody else they can hang out with us too, and actively trying to make it a safe space for them.
Right.
And it's go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's the same as the controversies in the comic book universe. And the thing is, those games
video games.
The game still exists. The first edition game still exists. Those issues of the comics that you love still exist. They're not gone. Right? They're still there for you. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and also, a lot of the people who are forwarding this kind of, let's say, anti-woke, saying you're ruining our games, this reactionary cultural commentary. I mean, it's a huge industry. Like, like you said, the comic book industry has a big reactionary contingent, television and film. It's not surprising that role-play games also attract this type of people. But there's one thing that Varn and I have often stressed as well. It's not even necessarily an ideological decision. It's a market decision. A lot of these reactionaries are like, the market will solve everything. I said, well, the market is making your games more diverse because these companies want to attract more people to play their games from a purely business perspective. And frankly, I don't see a problem with that, right? It's a capitalist company. If they're going to try, it makes complete sense. So a lot of people, want their cake and eat it. They want to be reactionary pro-market people. But then when the market dictates that their game actually should be more inclusive and like win over people from different communities who have hitherto felt excluded from the community, even if not super intentionally, like they have a big sulk about it.
Right. Yeah. You do put your thumb on an interesting contradiction right there, right, between this ideological purity and this idea that the free market is like it's not reconcilable. Right?
Yeah.
But somehow they're trying to square the circle. Anyway, back to you, Jeff.
Well, one thing that this made me think about is one year I was working at the Goodman Games booth at Gen Con. And we had there's one of the main kind of famous like DCC characters is a character named Shanna, and Shanna's a black woman with a big afro puff. And while I was at the booth, this black woman comes up to the table and like sees a picture of Shanna, and she's like, "Do you have any T-shirts with her on it?" And we didn't at the time. They had made there are shirts with Shanna on it. We just didn't have any in stock at the moment. But she was so excited that she saw that like she wanted this character on a T-shirt. Like it was so meaningful and impactful for her. And it just shows me that like yes, because like I'm a gay dude and I grew up feeling very uncomfortable about my queerness playing at Dungeons and Dragons tables. But regardless, I'm still a white dude. And like I was seeing lots of white dudes in the artwork, and it never occurred to me how meaningful that must have been to me to see somebody who looked like me doing cool, heroic things. And that's not something a lot of other people were getting. So I want other people to get that too.
So I think this kind of brings us back to the Appendix N, though, because I was the reaction I saw to the Appendix N literature was similar to the reaction I saw around, I think, with the sick puppies controversy after Gamegate.
The sick puppies, the sad puppies, the rabid puppies, all that stuff. Yeah. And then there's like the hashtag Pulp Rev group, and that's kind of more around like the Appendix N stuff. But you're right. Like when Hoi and I started the Appendix N Book Club, the first positive review we got was on a white supremacy blog. And and we knew that going in, which is why Hoi and I made a very intentional decision to have an episode 0 where we were going to talk about like our goal for the podcast. And we specifically were pointing out the fact that these books are written from 1979 and before. A lot of them have very outdated views on race, gender, sexuality. And Hoi and I were saying that we are not going to ignore those things. We are going to talk about them as we read them. We're not going to apologize for those things, but nor are we going to say that like we should boycott these things and not read them because of this. There's still historical importance there. And it's just fascinating reading what fantasy literature was like before Dungeons and Dragons kind of codified everything.
Right. And actual literary merit in many cases too. And that's,
yes,
that's not to be disregarded. So
absolutely. But Goodman Games, like so when the OSR movement was starting to happen, there was also this rediscovery of the Appendix N. And suddenly everybody's like reading Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and reading Elric and reading Conan stories again and and understandably getting very excited because they're fantastic books that people should read. But there was also a group of people who were also reading these and found it to be a breath of fresh air because now we're back to the time when men can be men and back before the era of quote unquote message fiction. And so there are people who were drawn to this because of those things that I'm going and reading them despite of.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I wanted to make it clear that we were in the despite of camp, not the because of camp.
That's a really that's an interesting point because I think in the culture, because in American society the culture war is often so polarizing, we end up with people, approaching this literature in a purely ideological fashion. So, you have your people who are using it to justify their reactionary perspectives, but I guess on the flip side, you have people who are like, we should boycott or not read these things because they're offensive as well. It's like, well,
right.
Like if you read anything written before like the year 2000, it's probably pretty offensive by today's standards, and that's fine so long as you don't have to sign on to all the offensive stuff. So I think we often get dragged down this sort of ideological culture war, which leads us to lose a lot of things, and also, from the right perspective, they like miss some of like the interesting historical observations you can make.
Yes,
from looking at this older literature, because they're trying to put it into a narrative that everything was good back in the day because Conan was like a hench heterosexual man.
Right. Well, I would even say that it's not even a right perspective issue. I think it's maybe also sometimes generational. We have a very, God bless them, this, very active, both online and out in the streets, younger population right now. But to a certain extent, I think some of them are a little ahistorical also. So they're just like, they're looking at the moment right now, right? Mm-hmm. And it's important.
Yeah.
To look at the problems of the moment. But one of our early negative reviews on iTunes is like, why should we even read this stuff, right? So I'm paraphrasing, right, Jeff?
Yeah, but basically, and the person's name was like 5e player or something, and it's like, why would I even want to read this stuff? But honestly, I think that's valid too. Like, I'm a white dude, and I'm still reading fiction about white dudes, so like, it's not hard for me to overlook the negative parts. But like for other people, it might be harder for them because of their lived experiences to want to read shit like this. And I get it. Like there's a lot of rape in this stuff too. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I can understand why maybe women wouldn't want to read this. So I'm not going to tell people that they should get over their ahistorical perspective and force themselves to read. Of course not. Of course, if you don't want to read this, don't. But I believe that there is a lot of value in exploring them, and I am able to overlook it. But it's like the whole thing about the art of the artist thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, death of the artist and others.
Yeah, it's like my favorite movie is Rosemary's Baby, but Roman Polanski is a child rapist. But like everybody has to make a decision for themselves where that line is for them.
Sure.
And I mean, the point I wanted to make, and I totally agree with Jeff. No one should have to read this stuff, especially if it's incredibly painful for them to read. It's like, oh, I've seen this already, right?
Yeah.
But I think a very fascinating discovery that we've made in this process is that, and it should probably have been obvious to us, but is that the circumstances of production of any media are always inform the actual media, the actual creative aspect of the media, right?
Yes.
And so a lot of the stuff was pulp fiction. So it's being say that it was written, they're being paid by the word. They have very short turnarounds. How long the actual fiction was is actually very important because the actual glue and the binding in paperbacks up till 1970 was a lot crappier than the glue that they use now. And so that sort of dictated how long books are. So it's really, to me, very interesting that also informed how the stories are actually being told, right? And obviously now if you have ebooks and everything like that, it gives you a different set of constraints, some of which are marketing based as opposed to, format based. So I think that's a very interesting thing to, I mean, you guys are in, left publishing, right? So that's a very, a baseline thing that you have to think about all the time, right?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, actually, we do make decisions on books, or we did, based off of how long it was, and we preferred shorter books because we could keep the price down for selling, because of the inflation of paper. Whereas ebooks have no real size limit, and they could be a pretty standard price. It's actually that's an interesting pressure in gaming in general, but because that affects things now. I mean, because basically all the companies are trying to keep their books about $50, and if you adjust for inflation, they're actually making less money per book than they were 10, 15 years ago. But there seems to be a natural cap on, like, okay, we can't go more than $60 per book unless it's huge. And I do think that really affects what people do in ways that they don't see. I also think what's interesting, I've listened to enough of your show. I've probably listened to 60 episodes or something as I'm like doing other work. I come out of this, my other interest is weird fiction, which has an equally problematic and overlapping heritage. Would you have some super progressive people and like basically almost Nazis in the background of that fiction? But you guys find a lot of the contradictions of the politics really interesting, because if you read these things closely, I think about the episode you did on Lee Carter, for example. That there are both colonialist and anti-colonialist tensions in that book that even the author doesn't seem to have fully parsed out. Are the various like hyper chauvinist parts of Conan, but then there's other parts of Conan that really aren't. And so how have you found exploring the literature and realizing that the politics may just be more complicated than even the authors intended?
From my standpoint, I mean, I'm glad it's there, right? I mean, even like we could talk about Conan specifically, or Robert E. Howard. I mean, no question, this guy grew up in Texas. There are people in living memory who had fought the Native Americans, who might have been fought for the Confederacy, or even been slaveholders. They would have been very old, but he might have met some of those people. And certainly there's some very offensive racial terms, some of his literature, but then other stories are really very much about like the actual consequences of a slave society. Pigeons from Hell, which is his most famous horror story, really is about the horrors of slavery rebounding 30, 40, 50 years later on. It's not told from the perspective of a black person, but it's still talking about those realities. And there's another story about where the villain, I think it's Black Canaan, where the villain is black, but he's totally justified in what he's doing because, again, he's reacting to generations of slavery. So there's right there with Robert E. Howard, and he was young at the time when he committed suicide. Had he lived, he would have lived well into the civil rights era, and it would be interesting to see what would happen there. I'm not saying that he would have become progressive, but he would have been interesting to see how he might have been informed. That it might have informed his fiction.
And then it's also interesting because we're reading Andre Norton as well. And for those who don't know, Andre Norton is a woman. And she specifically, first she started writing under the name Andrew North and then became Andre Norton. But either way, she's writing under a man's name. And there is this series that she wrote called the Witch World series, the Escarp stories. And the first book is just called Witch World. And it starts off with our male protagonist. And so, like, here's a book written with somebody with a male name, and the protagonist is a man. So it feels very safe for the presumed reader of this stuff to be reading this. But then, as you're kind of once this protagonist leaves this modern era noir world and goes through a portal to this like fantasy world, he ends up like encountering these like groups of like these like really powerful witch women who like have like this whole society. And then there's another female character who ends up like, who's like a princess, basically, who like, she's basically like the damsel in distress, but instead of letting a man save her, she ends up taking on a male's identity and a male's name and dressing up like a knight and like saving herself essentially, which is pretty radical stuff for the 1960s. And also really interesting that we've got a woman who's taking on a man's name. And then in this story, we have a woman who's taking on a man's name to like carve a place for herself, which is exactly what she's doing. And it's that kind of nuance that like, I really doubt people were picking up on that in the 1960s. Maybe they were. I might not be giving the readers of the 1960s enough credit, but I think it's in 2021, it's much easier for us to like explore the really interesting nuances of what's kind of happening underneath the surface of that.
One thing I will say about the Appendix N is that even by the standards at the time, there weren't a lot of female authors on it, because one of the things I've discovered going back into not so much pulps but popular genre fiction is that you often can't tell by names, but there were a lot more women writing it than people thought, and there were a lot more women reading it probably than we can account for. So
yes,
I know some of that has been fixed later on. I also know that like Gygax particularly had some kind of professional relationship with Andre Norton, even because she wrote, I think, she wrote modules or stories for modules?
The very first novel, D&D novel, Quag King.
Okay,
yeah. And it's in Gary's home setting, Greyhawk, and the first chunk of it was published in Dragon magazine. But yeah, there are 3 women on the Appendix N list. There's Andre Norton, there's Lee Brackett, and there's
Margaret St. Clair.
I had Marilyn in my head, and I knew that was wrong.
So that is 10%, because there's actually 30 authors cited on the list. And this is probably people who might have been, oversights, as you say in there, and also it reflects his personal tastes. So it's a very idiosyncratic list. There's some exclusions on there that other people might point to and say, hey, why is that person left off the list?
Yeah, where's Clark Ashton Smith? Where's Ursula K. Le Guin? But then also ask yourself, why is Stanley G. Weinbaum there? Yeah. There's great questions in both directions, and honestly, I think people put a lot of thought into the whys, and I don't know that Gary put anywhere near as much thought or effort into this as we are trying to project onto that.
Right.
I mean, he probably just looked on his bookshelf and was like, this is what I've been reading.
Right.
Yeah.
This might be a good pickup. Yeah, because I was thinking, like Le Guin is obviously a quite
large omission.
Yeah, it's a big exclusion from that list, but then again, like you say, you may not have just picked up the book.
Right. And, she's included 3 years later on the BX list, which is on the Tom Mulvey sort of basic version, which a lot of people would have seen, especially younger readers.
And that's an incredibly... is that what you're about to say, Hoi?
Oh, yeah. It's a much more inclusive list, and it includes a lot of nonfiction, YA stuff like that. And I think it was put together with the help of a librarian. I can't remember her name.
Yes. But that also shows us the importance of having diverse voices also writing in these things, because now that we have a woman putting this list together, we now have more women on the list. So that's also why, and I'm not saying that men shouldn't be allowed to write these things for those who are like getting all upset about this, although I'm mentioning your listeners are not those people, but still, it's like, this is not saying that men can't do it. It's just saying we need to have more people also writing this stuff.
Right. And the thing is, not being on the list doesn't in any meaningful way diminish the magnitude of your achievement as a writer, because it was, it's only 30 people. I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of great writers, even in that era, and so it doesn't, it's a weird thing for it to say for a couple guys who've done 120 episodes of podcasts to say that. Listen, don't take this list too seriously. It's not, it's not the it's not the Decalogue, right?
Although there is a reason why, starting with episode 101, we have expanded the criteria of the show to include any fiction that inspires your gaming. Because honestly, like I really enjoyed reading those first 100 books we read, but it was starting to get a little samey. So now we're reading other things like Amaro and Ursula K. Le Guin. And
Mhm.
Yeah. How's that been, actually having broaden it back out and go and as a person who listens, and I've actually really appreciated it, because I was also like, I haven't heard of some of these, I hadn't read some of these Appendix N authors, or I hadn't read them since I was a young child. Because I was reading pulps in the 80s from the library, but my taste in pulps were actually informed by my mother, so they were slightly different than Appendix N literature. So how's that been opening back up, and have you seen any contrasts like that are obvious, other than just that the lack of women and the amount of old white dudes, but anything else that you've noticed?
Um,
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, for me, it's just been it was the breath of fresh air that I really needed. We had, at this point, the Appendix N, the way that the list is written, some of it is an author followed by a specific book that Gary's suggesting you read, but also a lot of them are just like an author's name, and there's no like guidance beyond that. And some of these authors have written literally hundreds of novels. So if we were to do literally every single thing that's theoretically on the list, this could be like thousands of episodes of this show. And we weren't interested in, or I think Hoi had more tolerance for it than I did. Once we were in the 90s, I was like, Hoi, this is like, it's starting to beat me down. We need to make a change.
Well, I mean, even on our original schedule, I think we had, and this is 290 books on the list.
Yes.
Right? And that would have taken us another 6 or 7 years to get through. So,
yes. And I was looking ahead at that list, and I'm just like, I need something. I need something different. So now we're reading things by like Ellen Kushner and Clive Barker. And so we're like reading some really interesting stuff from like diverse voices that we didn't really have on before, Charles R. Saunders, things like that. But we're also exploring cool older stuff that wasn't on the list as well. Like we just read Titus Groan, which was incredible. We're currently in the process of reading William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland, which is from 1907. And it was, and it's the book that H.P. Lovecraft kind of considers to be like the reason he started writing the way he does. And when you read it, it's very clear why he considers that, because it feels like it feels like proto Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, I can't speak for all of our listeners, because obviously we haven't talked to all of them, but the ones who are, at least who are our patrons, because we opened this up. It's not just like all, just random new books. We said, okay, well, here's a list of 4 books every week that we think might be interesting to you. Pick one, and we throw that out to our readers. And
to our patrons. Yeah, our patrons get to vote on what we're going to cover. And starting with 101, it's our patrons voting.
And so that's been very positive. So, and it's also actually, sometimes we pick books and put books that we thought were going to be the ones that were going to get picked, and they picked a different one. So that's also been nice, because it's thrown us a little curveball there.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're never going to like completely go away from the sort of original mission statement. I mean, there's still a lot of books that we haven't covered that are pretty, gigantic on the list, like John Carter of Mars, and this, we still haven't finished all the Conan books. So those will definitely get covered. But it is nice to intersperse and to see things like, specifically, I think one that was very important to both of us was reading Imaro by Charles R. Saunders, who was an African-American writer who immigrated to Canada. And his creation of Imaro was very much, you could tell that he loved the pulps, but he didn't see himself in there. And so he deliberately created an African-influenced character. And it's a secondary world, it's a parallel universe, but it's a Black universe that's pre-colonial. So no influences of colonialism. There are cultures that are somewhat analogs to, for example, the Maasai and other cultures in Africa. But this is a way for him to really pull out the things that he most loved in pulp, in Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, but make it personally meaningful to him and hopefully meaningful to generations afterwards of people. And he's really been rediscovered. Unfortunately, he just passed away last year of COVID, but he really got rediscovered in the last year, I think. And people were aware of him, but he's and I really hope that rediscovery continues. And with that brings a lot of other writers who are working in the idiom. There's a lot of African influenced sword and sorcery out there that we haven't even touched upon yet. I know there's like people like Milton Davis and people like that, and
absolutely. And those are more contemporary people. Charles R. Saunders, these Amaro books we're talking about were written in the 1970s. So like this is also in the Appendix N era. It's not even post Appendix N era. It was available on the bookshelf next to any of these other stories.
Right. And there's a number of women writers of the same period, Joanna Russ, and a bunch of other writers that we should be looking at. And we'll look at. And I believe some of them are even now we know, but some of them were also trans or what we would now call non-binary. So that'll be interesting territory to explore. From my standpoint, especially I'm actually the sort of, for lack of a word, this sort of the old head history guy of the duo. So for stuff that I missed at that time, I'm really fascinated to go back to.
So. What has surprised you in the original Appendix N list? Like that you found something that was really surprising to you as literature that you didn't think was going to be interesting, or you didn't think was going to have any kind of progressive point or anything like that?
What was surprising from like a political progressive
either political or literary? I'm just what really, like, what did you get that you were not expecting?
From an apolitical perspective, the thing that I probably found the most surprising is how much science fiction there was in fantasy prior to Dungeons and Dragons. Also, how not all elves have pointy ears and not all dragons talk and are shaped like cats with wings. It's like it really, like, reading this stuff made it very obvious to me that once Dungeons and Dragons came out and exploded, suddenly we all came together as a society and decided that we now agreed on what fantasy was. Right. And prior to that, we didn't agree on what it was. And it's so fascinating reading this stuff where, like, it really is just like, let your imagination run completely wild. But now we've defined so much that it's all much more contained.
Even in the original runs of Dungeons and Dragons, I forget the name, but there was that campaign module where you found a spaceship with aliens and laser guns.
Journey to Barrier Peaks.
Journey to Barrier Peaks.
Expedition.
I definitely think the explosion in the 80s of Dungeons and Dragons and its reinforcement by the popularity of things like Games Workshop, like fighting fantasy novels, all these kind of industries that sprung out of Games Workshop, transformed the genre of fantasy, or at least I think you put it a little bit better, sort of defined and narrowed the genre of fantasy into something that is recognizably modern. And it happened over a relatively short period of time between the late 70s and the early 90s, basically a decade, and we have all these fantasy tropes, which are basically Tolkien-esque fantasy tropes, becoming kind of the standard of fantasy, whereas that was not. I mean, I'm actually thinking of Ursula Le Guin, who's someone I'm quite familiar with her literature. Raccoon's World is basically a fantasy novel, but it's also a sci-fi novel at the same time, right? So you have this kind of you don't have such a defined frontier between science fiction and fantasy writing until Dungeons and Dragons comes along and defines the tropes. And it is the Dungeons and Dragons followed by the Warhammer, followed by Warcraft, that have really fundamentally defined in our minds what a standard fantasy trope is, because everything else seems to be a derivation of that. Even the way, like, I always think about it, even the way that orcs look, like The orcs
Right,
are
Warcraft. Yeah, the green with the fangs and like Games Workshop orcs.
That's the Games
Yeah.
Workshop orcs became the Warcraft orcs.
Yeah.
And that's very different from like the portrayal of orcs. You know,
I'm pig-faced orcs all the way. That's
your pig.
Also,
pig
here's the thing that blows a lot of people's minds when I say this. Find one description in Tolkien's work where he describes elves as having pointy ears.
yes,
Find one.
But
It's not there.
In the artwork that Tolkien approved, they did have pointy ears.
Yeah.
That's fine, but it's not in his writing.
Right.
Well,
I think I think so. One thing that you guys have brought up in your podcast, I have something internal to the literature, but one thing that you have talked about to build on this point, and you've talked on your podcast, is the idea of IP, right?
Mhm.
That these things were definitely commercial things, and and some of them had movie adaptations, stuff like that, but there wasn't like a style manual that said like a
Right.
Conan story has to be like this, and it has to have these elements, and blah blah blah. I mean, it was whatever Howard started to write that day, what was ever like, so that even though these things were produced for very commercial reasons, I noticed that they were very personal and very idiosyncratic. So that's the sort of literary discovery that I sort of saw there. There's no mistaking Jack Vance for, Clark Ashton Smith. Although I definitely think that Clark Ashton Smith influenced Vance, right?
Of
There's
course.
no mistaking, Howard for Lovecraft, for Michael Moorcock. The other thing I noticed was that because these were written over a period of time, and there was a genuine fandom even then, they're actually acting in conversation with each other. Michael Moorcock is very, very much in conversation with Robert E. Howard, right?
Mhm.
That's he's deliberately talking about sort of the antithesis, right? But they're still in the sword and sorcery genre. It's not like he's not writing literary fiction all of a sudden. He's writing in the same genre, but the character is literally the antithesis of Conan, right?
Yeah.
Skinny, drug addicted, effete, over civilized, right? Right.
Mhm.
The other thing I noticed was that there was a certain amount of psychological acuity that I wasn't expecting in a lot of his literature. There's a lot of instances of what I would call, to the modern reader, PTSD in a lot of the protagonists. Certainly the protagonist in the beginning of Witchworld, he's a veteran of pretty clearly of World War II. He's on the run. He's become like sort of a borderline criminal.
Mhm.
Other characters like that, I think, spring up, and it's pretty clear that they have something resembling PTSD or other traumas and stuff like that. Now, I'm not a great fan of reading sort of therapeutic literature. That's, for me, it's more escapist, but I can see the value of it, and so that these characters are not just like some archetype. They are real characters in a lot of cases. Not every case, but a lot of cases.
Absolutely. And another thing that I was thinking of when we were talking about the science fiction and fantasy, but also when Varn was asking us about like if there were kind of any political surprises. I don't know if this is really political necessarily, but in the 1940s, Lee Brackett was writing this character named Eric John Stark.
Mm-hmm.
And Eric John Stark is black. And this is in a Sword and Planet world. So Eric John Stark is this black dude from Mercury who is hopping on spaceships, going to other planets, and then like fighting monsters in castles with swords. Like it's totally the science fiction in your peanut butter, but it's also a female author, a black protagonist. And it's the kind of things that I was not expecting to find things like that, especially things that were lifted right out of the pages of Weird Tales. I didn't realize that things like that existed. Right. Now, granted, whenever Weird Tales had any artistic depictions of Eric John Stark, he's suddenly blonde hair and blue eyed. Right. So there's still there were still, very obvious issues there, but the fact that they still even allowed for her to write a black protagonist in the 1940s is pretty incredible.
Kind of one thing I want to sort of ask then about this is one of the things that I think I'm getting from your reading of this sort of earlier, pre-1980s fantasy genre is that it seems like very free and in many ways like kind of more creative and less beholden to the kind of conventions that dominate fantasy writing today. Would you say in some ways, and obviously this is not in every way, but in some ways fantasy writing today when compared in the past is a little bit more on the tracks or is a little bit more pressed down under the weight of convention to a certain degree?
I think that's starting to change. I think in the past 10 years, we've been seeing a move away from that. But I really do think that from like 1980 to about 2010, we've been really stuck in that. Post 2010, I think we are still very mired in that, but I think we're starting to realize that there's other things to explore. I think from perspectives involving diversity, there's a lot more freedom, but I do think that, like, yes, when it comes to like what we will allow, what we will, I'm losing the word that I'm looking for here, but for what we will permit to be considered fantasy, I think that got very narrow and it's starting to broaden again. Right. But what do you think, Hoi?
I think you're right, but I think there's a couple things there, and some of it is as always, it's commercial. Prior to 1980, or certainly prior to 1960 or so, you had this whole market of the pulps, so people could sort of, and it was kind of low risk for the commissioning editors, right? Because they're paying like some trivial amount per word, and so they could see what kind of would fly. And this is almost like outsider art, termite art, a lot of this sword and sorcery stuff, right? And then by the time, with the around 1980 or so, we have the sort of the paperback implosion, and the mid list disappears. So everything has to be like a big deal when it's published, right? And so now the risk tolerance on the part of publishers really goes down. And so they're only going to go with what knows to have been so.
I mean, that's kind of like a general problem, I would say, in capitalist art production, right? Yeah. You have like, you have like an explosion of creativity. They hit on what is successful, and then the idea of taking risks becomes something distasteful to those funding it. I mean, you see it in the movie industry. Like, I'm like I used to love those Marvel movies, but I'm like, I just can't stomach another Marvel movie because they're just flogging us Marvel movie after Marvel movie after Marvel movie. Because they worked out that like that's the fucking type of film that sells, right?
And they're very uncinematic for. I mean, I love the characters and again the IP, but they're very uncinematic. I can't think of a Marvel movie that really like jumps out in my mind for its look, for its visual language, its visual storytelling. Yeah, I think though Jeff's point is good though. I mean, the audience is broader, so it's demanding more diversity in the actual literature that they're seeing. Also, I think the barriers to entry, as you guys were talking about, so now there's a certain amount of, now the problem might be discoverability, but now because people can e-publish and stuff like that, there's still a chance to start getting that stuff out there a little bit, and then you will then maybe get picked up if the people are saying, oh, there's this independently publishing, and their book was, there's books like Wool by Hugh Howey, is that right? A couple other major science fiction books that got picked up that were originally independently published and picked up by major publishers. So I think as long as the ebook platforms don't become completely locked down, I think that we will have a lot of people who might not have otherwise been tempted to write, or say, oh, the barrier's too high, I can't publish, how can I find an editor, all this stuff like that. A lot of it's going to be crap, but that was true at any period of time, right? And then the cream will rise, hopefully.
It's interesting because I was thinking about sci-fi in the same time period that we're talking about. Sci-fi actually breaks a lot of its conventions in the 70s and 80s and actually expands its definition, and fantasy retracts. Yeah. You think about like the new sci-fi movement. I guess the only thing I would add as far as like the literary market goes is there's an overproduction of MFAs. I know I'm one of them. Yeah. And a lot of those people who were trained in prior ages to have disdain for outsider art and genre art. And I know in poetry, for example, we've seen the collapse, that's my field, of like the distinctions between slam, street poetry, academic poetry, etc. That like you go to a poetry festival now, and that's increasingly not a meaningful distinction. And it's partly because the market has fallen out, and so there's nothing keeping us, like we're basically throwing spaghetti against the wall. And also partly because like now we all realize we have to share a market. Like there's not enough of a market share for everybody to have these weird micro niches, and I think that's affected sword and sorcery and fantasy publishing a lot. And I've also think people have noticed, actually because of podcasts, I think in particular this whole literary podcast thing that you guys are a part of, that the old genre markers don't really hold. And like, maybe I was projecting fantasy stuff on on Anne McCarthy's Dragon Riders of Pern and ignoring the science fiction elements of it because I thought everything should look like Dragonlance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's the swinging pendulum, you know. We have weird fiction, and like let's pretend weird fiction is the beginning. Obviously, it's not because everything is inspired by something preceding it. But choosing a random beginning and calling it weird fiction. Here we have this genre that is science fiction. It's fantasy. It's horror. It's all of these things. And as weird fiction is getting more popular, we start kind of subdividing it into fantasy, science fiction, horror. And then once we've subdivided those, we now want to subdivide horror into different categories and fantasy into different categories. And the more and more we start trying to describe the things that people are already making, the more and more kind of genre tags we're getting. But once we get those genre tags and people decide like, oh, I want to write grimdark, or, oh, I want to write this other thing. Like now you're writing within the confines of this thing that's already existing for you. And then I think after a while of people doing that, they start to be like, oh, I don't like these confines anymore. Let's break out of it. So it's this pendulum swinging between not over categorizing everything to categorizing things to the point of suffocation and then back. Right. And I think right now we're kind of in the moving back direction.
I would also say with the growth of IPs that don't come out of literature but come out of other types of media, movies obviously is a good one, like the Star Wars extended universe, but also the Warhammer IP, and then also video game IP. That has a kind of peculiar effect on the genre as well, because there's so much financial incentive to produce for those companies that are creating literature to support their products.
Yes.
Black Library for Games Workshop, that is a huge industry that sucks up a lot of talent because, again, you know, you could risk writing your sci-fi novel that nobody would read because it's like nobody knows the IP. Or you are like, I'm a good literary talent. I'm going to sell my skills to Games Workshop and write Warhammer 40,000 literature. Or I'm going to go write a League of Legends novel, or, you know, a Warcraft novel. So, you know, I'm glad to hear, you know, that, you know, the pendulum is swinging away from the kind of very sort of static and conservative notion of what fantasy is that prevailed for the 3 decades between the 1980 and 2010. I just worry that a lot of talent will start to get sucked up by these big IP projects because it will just, you know, it's hard to make a living as a writer, and good writers will gravitate towards those projects which can perhaps offer them more security.
I mean, yeah, there's no doubt about that. And then the other thing that might be affecting that is the sort of the algorithms and SEO. You see a lot of independently novels on Amazon lists, and the titles are just like, the tags are just ridiculous. You can see it's just optimized for SEO, right?
Yeah.
Like, for discoverability.
Well,
so
we just
there are
had
a lot
Ellen. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of distorting effects like you're talking about that are clearly market driven and are not purely artistic, unfortunately.
Well, we just had Ellen Kushner on the show too, and she started out by writing choose your own adventure books. And she was talking about how, like, yeah, like that paid the bills. So maybe for some of these authors, this is going to be where they're starting to pay their bills to actually get their literary career going. But then they might be stepping out of these IPs and making their own stuff that's also interesting.
Yeah, I guess since we're a gaming show, I'm going to turn it. Our last question is going to turn it back to gaming, but I wanted to parallel this with the OSR because I've noticed recently that the content in the OSR is also diversifying a lot. Like I go on Exalted Funeral and look at what's up there, and I'm like, oh, like there's a lot more interesting. Like it's not just D&D clones anymore.
Yeah.
And the D&D clones are being written in a broader and broader way. One of your guests who I don't think he'd done Old School Essentials he was one of your first guests.
Gavin Norman.
Yeah. Has done a lot.
It was called BX Essentials at that time, I think, and he was just starting it.
Yeah.
Right. Has deliberately created a very open like rule set that is very streamlined, and yet also you can pretty much stack anything fantasy you possibly wanted on it.
Yeah.
Do you see basically as the 70s and 80s gamers kind of frankly age into the twilight,
into the grave?
They go into the west.
Yes, they sail to the west.
Yeah.
Do you see some of the, like, because I think a lot of the reaction in the OSR is actually tied to nostalgia. Do you see a lot of that just changing because the nostalgia is going to change and be of a more diverse, less monocultural time? Or do you also see that the market pressures are put out there too?
It's
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Hoi.
I think both. I mean, there's going to be nostalgia for nostalgia at a certain point. You know how like every 20 years there's a 50s revival. You know, right now we're in a 90s revival for all things. So, I think there's always going to be, I don't know how niche it'll get. There's always going to be people who are going to be interested in the very primal versions of stuff, because there's always going to be people who are going to be a little bit punky, want to strip stuff down, get to the roots of stuff. So there's that. But add their own gloss on it by their own lived experiences, right? And not just say like, oh, this is, I want to play it exactly in 1970. I said, I want to play it in 1970, but as if I was there and not.
Yeah, totally. Right. Absolutely. And I think different people are drawn to nostalgia, because I don't think everybody who's playing OSR games are drawn by nostalgia, but I do think some people are. And I think different people are drawn by nostalgia for different reasons. And I don't know what person X's reason is for really wanting to play the games of their youth. But because some people are being drawn to these for very personal reasons, I think that people can be very protective of it. And any efforts from the outside to change something that they love, that they know and love, on instinct feels very threatening. And I think because of that, it's some people's instinct to immediately fight against that and think that the people who are trying to change this are hurting this thing that they love. And I think that's natural. I think acting as though nobody's going to do that is probably not very reasonable. But I also think it's important not to over-engage with that, because I think every time we see something that like outrages us, we get, what I've seen is we get so in our outrage, and I've been guilty of this too, 100%. I'm not claiming to have been above this historically. I think I'm doing better now, but I feel like sometimes we so engage with the outrage that it causes that other person to dig their heels in even deeper, and it starts drawing more attention to these things. None of those things I think are particularly helpful for us.
Has that informed your choice of guests? Because I've noticed like the diversity and all that is very clear and present, but it's also very soft on your show. So it's there. I mean, it's stated. It's not, you're not like playing it down that you're inviting a bunch of diverse guests on, a lot of women and a lot of non-binary people actually in all kinds of groups. But that when you discuss it, it's discussed A, positively, and not as like a culture war division, and B, it's soft. Like, has that been deliberate on your part because of what you just said, or because it's just something I'm noticing?
I mean, I think all our guests are really fascinating, and that's me what I want to hear. And anybody's fine. And we've had some people who would definitely be on as you say, soft, but on the right end of the spectrum. Anyone who's going to really bring an interesting conversation and talk to us in good faith, and we always engage with them in good faith if they're on our show. You know, we might push back on some things, and they might push back on some things that we say, but as long as it's in good faith, and that they are people that we would otherwise be willing to sit across the table from, not people who are like deny other people's right to exist. And they're welcome on the show.
Right.
We're not giving them platforms.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like it's always a fine line between, you know, making sure you're not in an ideological bubble and then engaging with people who are just like not going to accept you. And it's a difficult one to, you know, navigate at times. And, you know, you never make anyone or everybody completely happy with the choices that you make, but you know, it is what it is. That's what the game is, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's the game.
Right. And initially the show was just me and Hoi. And then Hoi and I started bringing guests on. And initially we were primarily bringing guests on who were people who were already very excited about the Appendix N, which was predominantly white dudes. And then we started making an effort to, we don't just want white dudes on here who already know about the Appendix N. Let's bring other people on here as well.
Right.
So we have been making an effort to have a broad range of voices on the show. But yeah, although we're making that effort, it's not like we're not actively excluding people unless they're, already like, we don't want to, I guess that's not true. We are actively excluding people who we don't want to specifically give platforms to, but we're not picking people who are then specifically on the opposite side of that necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's like you don't want a homophobic anti-Asian Nazi on your show. Right.
Sure. Nor do I want somebody whose only interest in being on the internet is to cancel these people and shut them down. And that's the only thing that they're capable of talking about. I'm also not particularly interested in hanging out with you either. That's also not very interesting to me.
And people want to have an interesting conversation. They want to actually engage. I mean, we've had guests and even us ourselves had a couple books that we've really not liked, but we've always tried to find something interesting to talk about in those books. So as long as they're willing to engage, both with the book itself and in the conversation, then that's the kind of person we want to talk to. And again, there's definitely some people who are definitely very, very different worldviews. But again, we're meeting at a certain point, which is the book, right?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about that.
So we've been talking a little bit about your podcast, but I want you to plug it. I am a patron of your podcast, so that's how I know you guys. I haven't participated in your actual book club because I'm also a constant streamer and produce 2 podcasts and have a writing career and a teaching job. So
unacceptable. Yeah, unacceptable.
But I listen, and I wanted to say I've gotten a lot out of your podcast, specifically because it meets 2 worlds for me, which is the weird fiction, fantasy, like going back and like exploring these kind of pulp literature that probably has more literary merit than we give it credit for, but also gaming. And there's not a lot of podcasts that do that. There are a couple, but you're kind of in a special niche. So
yeah, the first half of our episode is always about the book from a literary perspective, and the second half is always about how we can apply what we've read in this book to our gaming, what we can steal to inspire our games, things like that.
Right. And even the people who aren't gamers, we can talk to them at least about the world building as an aspect, like how they would approach that. And so that's fun. Yeah.
So where can people find you?
AppendixNBookClub.com. Hoi, where else?
Okay, we're on Twitter at @appendix_n, and you can always drop us a note at appendixnbookclub@gmail.com. So we'd like to hear from people. So
yeah, and if you want to check out our Patreon, it's patreon.com/appendixnbookclub. Our patrons are able to hang out with us before we record the shows with our special guests, and we also record those patron book clubs and release those to our patrons. And for each episode, as Hoi had mentioned earlier, we put out a choice of 4 different books that our patrons then vote on to choose which books we're covering with each episode. That started with 101.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
Thank you. I was going to say you also have cool merch. So if you would, I ordered one of your shirts. It hasn't come in yet.
Yeah,
I noticed you're wearing it.
Yeah.
So
and special thanks to Rick Byrne for designing that stuff.
Yes.
That's a cool beholder you have there. He's doing a read. Well, guys, Jeff, Hoi, thank you so much for coming on our show. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you for having us on.
Really great to talk about the literary side of things. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope you will come back on again in the future.
Oh, there's so much more to talk about. Yes,
about more books. And maybe we can all read a book beforehand and do a crossover episode.
Special, that would be great. Yeah.
That'd be very cool. I would love that.
Yeah.
Well, anything to plug before we leave, Varn? Since you're talking to yourself from the past, because this will be in the future.
I don't know if it'll be released yet, but by the time that you hear this, there will be a recording regular on my Patreon with Sean KB of Antifada podcast, where we talk about this time we're talking about the current political situation and the development of strike waves around the world. Very different than what we're talking about right now. That's pretty much it. There are some other specialists coming on, but the show that I am immediately doing would have already been released by the time this comes out, so I'm not going to plug it.
Well, awesome. Well, there'll be stuff on TIR tomorrow and yesterday. It's all pre-recorded because we're taking a break for the holiday. But we wish you a Merry Christmas from Gaming Materialists, or a Hanukkah or a Kwanzaa or whichever holiday you choose to celebrate, even if you're just doing the traditional Druidic Yule log worshipping.
There you go.
So have an excellent holiday season. Happy Shabi Yalda in Iran, of course, which is the solstice. And we are out.